Welcome. My name is Paul Halliday, and I am chair of the Corcoran Department of History, and it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce the 12th Cross Lecture. In particular, I want to point out that Ruth Cross is with us today. It's in large part through her generosity that we have this annual occasion to celebrate the thinking and work of a colleague. That fact is in memory of her late husband, Robert D. Cross. He was the son of a congregational minister born in Grinnell, Iowa, who went on to become a leading figure in the study of religion in American life. After earning degrees in Harvard, I've always been struck by the fact that he, along the way there, then was a bomber pilot in World War II, was president of Hunter College and then Swarthmore College, where he had in fact also taught, as well as teaching at Bryn Mawr and Columbia, before coming here in 1972, where he served as the Dean of Arts and Sciences and then as a member of the Department of History here until 1994. It's in his memory, then, that we celebrate our collective intellectual lives each year in this lecture. The chief celebrant this year is Gary Gallagher, our lecturer, the John L. Now Professor of History and the director of the John L. Now Center for Civil War History here in the department at the University of Virginia. Gary is the co-author and/or co-editor of more than a dozen books. He's the sole author of another 8 books. He's won numerous teaching prizes and prizes for those books. One of the things you get to do as a department chair is read people's course evaluations every year. And the thing I love about Gary's is the number of them that begin something like this. I'm a 4th-year student who signed up for a class that meets 3 days a week at 8 a.m. I didn't miss a single one. They were all spectacular. And then they go on some variation of those themes, usually running through a little bit of real hard tack, a gun being fired, and a lot of inspirational things being taught to them about American military history, and in particular, the history of the Civil War. But among those books, I'll note 3 that really catch my eye: Becoming Confederates, The Union War, and one suggestively subtitled, How Hollywood and Popular Art Shape What We Know About the Civil War. In a lot of ways, that subtitle, like Gary's teaching, and more generally his concern for the public's understanding of the Civil War, is really what I think he's probably going to be getting at today, and manifests something that has been consistently important in Professor Gallagher's work all of these years. Not just helping us know the Civil War in the abstract as a moment lived through by millions of people, but to keep us thinking about how we are thinking about it and the ways in which the ways we have thought about it have changed over the decades. It's for that reason, then, I think, that he's going to give us the cross lecture this year entitled All About Us: Projection, Wishful Thinking, and Anachronism in Recent Civil War Scholarship. Join me, please, in welcoming to the podium Gary Gallagher.
I'm going to switch microphones here because I may be moving around just a little bit before I'm finished today. Thank you, Paul, and I want to thank the Department of History and express my great appreciation for being invited to give this lecture. Considering the roster of previous lectures, I view this as a really special honor for someone who is here at UVA. And I want to thank Christian McMillan, who's contrived not to be here this afternoon. He's in State College. I don't know how long it took him to put that invitation together. But he's the one who invited me to come. He's the one who really oversaw the details that have brought all of us here together this afternoon. The recent national and local debate regarding the memory of the American Civil War, and particularly about how lost cause iconography and memorial landscapes should be treated, persuaded me to focus this afternoon on what I see as common misconceptions about the conflict that have arisen in both the public and scholarly worlds. I've devoted a good deal of my attention over the past 25 years, maybe even more than that, I don't like to think about it, to how the generation that experienced the war, fought it and lived it, how that generation created and disseminated strikingly different interpretations of what had happened, and how those interpretations, most especially the Lost Cause school that rose from the ruins of Confederate defeat, resonated with subsequent generations of Americans. In all my classes, I try to get students to understand the difference between history and memory, try to get them to understand that something actually happened, but that how people choose to remember it often provides a kind of smorgasbord of different ways to understand it. And I tell them that memory often trumps reality in this regard, that really it's how we choose to use our conception of the past that matters most, not what really happened. I use films in these classes. What Paul said suggests why that's the case. I'm fascinated by how Hollywood influences our understanding of the past. It's far more than everything we do put together and squared in influencing people. More people go see the most wretched movie about the Civil War, of which there are many, than come to read the books and sit in classes of all the Civil War historians in the United States, probably put together and then multiplied by something. Films have been by far the most powerful and far-reaching cultural vehicle for transmitting elements of these various traditions created by the people who lived through the war. I also, of course, use literary sources from the 19th century and later scholarly works to demonstrate for both undergraduates and graduate students the ebb and flow of how Americans have connected with our greatest national trauma. I chose my title for the lecture today carefully. I realize it's a little bit edgy, but what I want to do is underscore the degree to which factors unrelated to historical evidence come into play in both the popular and scholarly realms. The bulk of my talk is going to address two examples of this phenomenon. The first is the handling of emancipation, where I believe projection and wishful thinking come into play. And the second is the question of when the war ended, where anachronism seems very evident to me. In pursuing these examples, I'm going to concentrate not on the Confederacy, but rather I will address the entire conflict. When I do get more specific, it's going to be on the U.S. side of things, not on the Confederate side of things. I find it noteworthy that a number of scholars have embraced interpretive conventions that align them in very interesting ways with the purveyors of lost cause arguments, extending from former Confederates in the post-Appomattox period through neo-Confederates in our own time. This unlikely situation arises from a shared tendency to go where the preponderance of evidence simply does not lead. Nonetheless, we end up there. I see two things at work in the examples I'm going to explore this afternoon. The first is what I call the Appomattox syndrome, which is a way of engaging with the conflict that begins at the end of the story with knowledge of United States victory and the destruction of slavery, and ranges backward through the evidence to find materials that point toward those two outcomes as essentially inevitable. The second factor is a predilection for reading the past through the prism of our own experience. In this instance, dealing with the interpretive impact of the Civil Rights Movement and its aftermath, the Vietnam War, and more recently, the Middle Eastern conflicts of the last 15 years. I hasten to add, as all of you know, there's nothing novel about bringing contemporary political, cultural, and intellectual baggage to bear on historical analysis. Earlier generations of Civil War historians certainly have done this, whether the blundering generation and needless war schools that drew on reactions to World War I, or the consensus school that flowered in the wake of World War II, or the ignore the military side of the Civil War altogether orthodoxy of the post-Vietnam era. In all these instances, scholarship often reveals almost as much about the time in which it appeared as it does about the events and personalities that it explores. Let me make one important framing observation before moving on to the heart of my lecture, and that is, United States victory was not inevitable during the Civil War. That's one of the most attractive misconceptions about the war. Of course the Yankees won. They had so much of everything. All those men, all that stuff, They had to win. They looked like us. The Confederacy was anachronistic even in the mid-19th century. How could some place like that actually triumph in what was a mid-19th century modern war between two nation states? The Confederacy did face a firm challenge because of the Union's edge in manpower and material strength, but it also possessed significant advantages. I don't have time to go through all of them this afternoon, but I will mention three. One was it had a much lower bar to cross in order to achieve success. All it had to do was convince the civilian population of the United States that it was not worth the human and material cost to press this thing any longer. These are two democratic republics at war. The war would end when one of the civilian population said, that is it. We're not going to continue this war any longer. All the Confederacy had to do, in essence, was get a tie. Tie was as good as a win for them, and they have independence. The size of the Confederacy was a second major advantage. It's 750,000 square miles. It's as large as all of Western Europe, and it had a very poor system of transportation in terms of its infrastructure, which meant that a modern army trying to maneuver in a place that large, in a place with that kind of transportation infrastructure, would be facing huge logistical problems. The size of the colonies, of course, had posed a huge problem to mighty Great Britain during the Revolution. The same thing was true during the War of 1812. The sheer size was a problem. Well, the sheer size of the Confederacy is a huge problem. And their third advantage was they're fighting on the defensive, literally to protect their homes. That almost always conveys an advantage to the participant in a war where one side is defending home and one side is seeking to project military power into someone else's bailiwick. For inspiration, Confederates could look to the experience of the American Revolution, which they did endlessly. By any standard of measurement, the colonists faced far more intimidating odds in their struggle against Great Britain, something all Americans, whether north or south of the Potomac and the Ohio rivers, understood very well. As George Wythe Randolph, Thomas Jefferson's grandson, and for a time the Confederate Secretary of War, he's part of a procession, there were 5 of them. But as Randolph put it in October 1861, quote, "They may overrun our frontier states and plunder our coast, but as for conquering us, the thing is an impossibility. There's no instance in history of a people as numerous as we are inhabiting a country so extensive as ours being subjected if true to themselves." Poor Randolph, back in October of 1861, hadn't gotten the email that said it's a hopeless war against odds we can't overcome yet. I guess that would come later. It would come later. It would come right after the war, when Confederates are facing a problem that no other segment of white America has had to face. And that is, how do we explain a catastrophic military defeat that also destroyed the slaveholding social system we seceded and went to war to protect in the first place, killed perhaps 30% of all our military-age white males, figure 18 million dead Americans now, if you want to know how many the proportion would be with our population now, and cost us significant power in the national arena for many, many years. We have to explain how that happened and make ourselves look as good as possible. And so what they did was adopt an argument that became a crucial tenet of lost cause dogma, namely, that the rebels had waged a hopeless cause against overwhelming numbers and resources. And they waged it not in the name of slavery, another part of the lost cause argument, but in pursuit of high constitutional principle. They, not the Yankees, were the true inheritors of the founders' tradition. So they believed enough in high constitutional principles to essentially engage in self-immolation for 4 years. And how can you say that was bad when it's all over? It's actually quite noble. If you want to see a good example of this, we never could have won view of the war, go over to the University Cemetery, where there are about 1,000 Confederates buried who died in the hospitals here at UVA, and look at the Confederate Soldiers Monument there. It was erected in 1893. It conveys very clearly this idea in the inscription that greets visitors who enter the cemetery through the main entrance. It says this: "Fate denied them victory, but crowned them with glorious immortality." Well, who can overcome fate if fate is not on your side? You're probably going to lose if fate is against you. That's something Shelby Foote certainly embraced. His work includes, it's still around, a good deal of lost cause emphasis. He presented this to the millions of viewers who watched Ken Burns's The Civil War, which first aired in 1990, as many of you know, and which seems to air pretty much all year long in PBS fundraising efforts now. If I hear the Ashokan farewell one more time, I always feel like going out and kicking a cat or something. But anyway, Shelby Foote, in that, put it this way, in his sort of sugary Mississippi accent. I think if there'd been more, wait, let me start again. I never know whether to do this or not, but I'm going to. I think the North fought that war with one hand tied behind its back. I think if there'd been more Southern victories, a lot more, the North simply would have brought that other hand out from behind its back. I don't think the South ever had a chance to win that war. And there he is. Gray hair, gray beard. For God's sake, he looks like he was talking to Lee at Appomattox. If anybody would know that the war was hopeless, old Shelby would know. And he's just helping us out. Well, that assertion gets you off the hook. If you are a Confederate, well, we lost. But of course we lost, because we never could have won. This claim of inevitable United States victory constitutes a neat way, indeed a very clever way, for former Confederates to absolve themselves of responsibility for, as I said earlier, this catastrophic effort to establish a slaveholding republic, and to look their fellow white Southerners in the eye and say, yes, I know, perhaps 300,000 of our military-age white men are dead, but look, this is what happened. We never could have won. It was a gallant fight. All right, the first of two main parts, and I see what time it is. I'm not going to run long, I promise. First of the two main parts of my talk, the influence of what I see of projection and wishful thinking on the handling of emancipation and union during the war. Every generation of Americans has found in the Civil War what suits its needs and has overlooked or marginalized things that do not. Our current preoccupation with race as a profession and a society was much in evidence as the sesquicentennial years unfolded between 2011 and 2015. I'm going to use National Geographic magazine in a comparative way here, because it paid a good deal of attention to both the centennial of the American Civil War and the sesquicentennial of the war. I first became entranced with the conflict as a 10 and 12-year-old in 1961 and 1963, reading special issues about the Civil War in National Geographic. I just found them absolutely captivating. That's an autobiographical aside. You can now forget that I said it. The magazine's coverage in the early 21st century mirrors the most obvious and noteworthy change in popular understanding of the conflict between the 1960s and the sesquicentennial. A map from the April 2005 issue of the magazine titled, quote, "A Nation Transformed by War," places slavery and emancipation at the absolute center of the conflict. This surely had not been the case during the centennial, when reconciliation and the lost cause were most in evidence. National Geographic in 2005 reflected the degree to which a vast body of scholarship that followed in the wake of the civil rights struggle of the 1950s and 1960s has brought seismic change to the field of Civil War studies. The experiences of Black people, the process of emancipation, and the ways in which attitudes toward race affected actors and events have inspired myriad influential books and articles, and have thereby reversed decades of scholarly neglect through much of the 20th century. The importance of slavery and race dominated interpretive pieces in popular newspapers and magazines relating to the war's 150th anniversary. For example, in April 2011, John Meacham, 2 years beyond his Pulitzer Prize for biography of Andrew Jackson, contributed an article to Parade. I got my copy as an insert in the Washington Post. Parade, another magical thing that happens. "We must remember our nation's history fully, not selectively," stated Meacham. "Americans need to recall what the war was about, slavery, and the definition of human liberty. And the Civil War's true legacy is about a nation's obligation to live up to the best part of itself, Slavery was an evil, and it had to be defeated. As we reflect on the war, concluded Meacham, in a textbook example of deploying a usable past, let us never forget that it was fought to rid us of a monumental prejudice and that we must remain vigilant about confronting inequality in our own time. Meacham's piece underscores the powerful stream of recent scholarship that, in my view, has produced a paradoxical result, and which prompted me to write the book that Paul mentioned, The Union War. On the positive side, this literature leaves no doubt that slavery-related issues must be an essential part of any exploration of the American Civil War. On the negative side, it masks the fact that race and emancipation, while very important, did not preoccupy the mass of loyal citizens of the United States during the war. And in doing so, this phenomenon tells us more about what we consider important than about what animated the wartime populace. This scholarship casts emancipation as the greatest outcome of the conflict, argues that it alone justified the awful human and material carnage, insists that soldiers and civilians in the United States recognized this and locates the seeds of slavery's destruction, an outcome that often assumes a triumphalist sense of inevitability, very early in the war. Here's an instance of the Lost Cause School and many recent historians getting on board the United States victory was inevitable train, because anyone who assumes that emancipation was inevitable also must embrace the idea of certain United States victory. Emancipation sure as hell was not going to come if the United States did not win the war. So if emancipation is inevitable, so also is U.S. victory. What this interpretation does not illuminate is the immense importance to the generation that experienced the Civil War of the concept of union. And without a firm understanding of the importance of union within a mid-19th century context, I believe it is impossible to grasp the meaning of the Civil War era. This interpretation also reminds us of the need to separate causation and wartime motivation. Slavery absolutely stood at the vortex of what triggered secession and then war. It did not hold a similar position in terms of motivation for the loyal citizenry to fight a massive and costly war to compel 11 wayward states to return to the Union. A pair of recent works will illustrate how emancipation has trumped union as an analytical lens through which historians examine the conflict. In 1861, The Civil War Awakening, which Knopf published in 2011, a widely reviewed and much applauded book, Adam Goodhart insists that, quote, men and women at the time on both sides of the conflict did understand it as a war against slavery, even before it began. Goodhart describes the conflict as a revolution that started, quote, years before the first guns opened, as a gradual change in the hearts and minds of men and women until suddenly, in the months before the attack on Sumter, this transformation attained irresistible momentum. I'm going to now pause to state the obvious. Goodhart's analysis reeks of inevitability. Even before the war, it's inevitable. James Oakes's Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861 to 1865, Norton published it in 2012. It's now the obvious first book to consult on emancipation, specifically addresses the relative importance of union and emancipation as goals embraced by the loyal citizenry of the United States. I always believed that the purpose of the war shifted from union to emancipation, writes Oakes, but over the course of my research, that familiar shift vanished like dust in the wind, and I have been unable to recover it. Republicans never had to move from union to emancipation, claims Oakes, because the two issues, liberty and union, were never separate for them. If there was a shift over the course of the war, it was the realization by Republicans that destroying slavery would be much harder than they originally expected. Now, Oakes knows emancipation was not inevitable. I know he knows it because he says it in his book. He warns readers that it was not. Yet those readers of Freedom National would conclude three very important things. First, that most Northerners disliked slavery intensely prior to 1800. Second, that enslaved people knew even before fighting erupted that, quote, Lincoln's election was of vital importance to the prospects for freedom and anticipated U.S. Army setting up, quote, an alternative government inside the South, but beyond the police powers of Southern slave society. And third, that Republicans, who controlled the vast military resources of the United States, ardently pursued emancipation from the outset. Combining those things with knowledge about Appomattox could, and I would say almost certainly would, lead the unwary to assume slavery's end to be inevitable during the great national bloodletting. Goodhart's and Oakes's books and much other recent literature can be reassuring in suggesting the war inevitably ended slavery. I think we should do our best to resist that tempting notion. We also should be very careful in how we interpret words from the 19th century. I'm speaking to the choir here. You all understand this. For example, should we join Meacham and Oakes in claiming that the word liberty, when used by the wartime generation, meant that people were talking about slavery and emancipation? And what about freedom, as deployed by Lincoln in his address at Gettysburg and in innumerable other instances? Would Americans at the time automatically have inferred that a new birth of freedom, to quote Lincoln, had to do with black people and emancipation? The answer to both those questions, I believe, is no. Liberty and freedom for millions of white people had to do with the legacy of the founders that guaranteed ordinary white citizens a role in their own governance and the possibility of rising economically. They had to do, in the most fundamental sense, with the promise and value of union. And when I say millions of white people in the free states, our friend, the 1860 census, tells us that the population of the free states in 1860 was 98.8% white. When you read in a book that people in Vermont acted as if they lived in a white republic, they did live in a white republic. The black people lived in the slaveholding states in the mid-19th century. Untold loyal citizens believed that a failure to save the Union would scuttle the hard and bloody work of the revolutionary generation. And beyond the North American continent, they did think beyond the North American continent, they believed that it imperiled the future of democracy in a Western world increasingly dominated since the failed European revolutions of the late 1840s by oligarchs, aristocrats, and monarchists. That's their view of it. When Lincoln called the nation the last best hope of earth, he did so with an affirming rather than a didactic purpose. The people of the loyal states, he knew very well, already possessed a deep-seated belief in American exceptionalism as a democratic beacon and a bastion of self-government and individual opportunity. First to last, the mass of loyal citizens identified union as the war's great goal. They said this in 1861. They said this in 1865. Republican Congressman Roscoe Conkling, who later became a very famous senator, struck a very common note on June 18th, 1865, in a speech to members of the 117th New York Infantry, who were on their way home. They stopped in Utica after having served in Virginia and North Carolina. In all this career of glory, of duty, and of daring exploit, said Conkling in delivering a paean to Union, a common purpose has inspired you, a common hope has led you on. Peace with the government and the Constitution our fathers established has been the object of the war and the prayer of every patriot and every soldier. No one better understood the bedrock appeal of union across the loyal states than Lincoln, who as late as December 1864, this is after the Republicans had smashed the Democrats in the November elections that year, when they were going to have a 4-to-1 majority in the Senate and an overwhelming majority in the House. It's after that, and in his last annual message to Congress, that he offered this. In a great national crisis like ours, unanimity of action among those seeking a common end is desirable, is very desirable, almost indispensable. In this case, the common end is the maintenance of the Union. The proposed 13th Amendment, which the ballots in November proved to be favored by a majority of the electorate, stood in Lincoln's words, quote, among the means to secure that end. Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, which came out in 2012, the second year of the sesquicentennial, deals specifically with passage of the 13th Amendment through the House of Representatives in January 1865. It had passed in the Senate the preceding spring, had been voted down in the House, and is now brought up in the House again in January 1865. But Spielberg's film conveys to viewers precisely the opposite sense of what was paramount in most of the loyal citizenry's mind. For the filmmaker, it was emancipation, not union, that predominated. For most of the loyal white citizenry, emancipation was just what Lincoln suggested in his effort to court wide support for the war. It's a means to the greater end of union. Apart from the very small number of abolitionists and some radical Republicans, white citizens, including many Democrats inside and some outside the Army, embraced emancipation for three reasons. Most white loyal citizens did embrace emancipation, but not for the reasons that we would prefer. They embraced it for three reasons. Number one, killing slavery would help defeat the Confederacy. Second, it would punish the slave-holding oligarchs who precipitated the war in the first place. And third, it would remove the only internal factor anyone could imagine threatening the Union going forward. Get rid of slavery. We're not going to have a replay of what happened during the secession winter of 1860-61. All these reasons had to do with union, restoring it and making it safe in the future, rather than with mounting a great moral crusade to destroy a hateful institution and help millions of African Americans. In his massive biography of Lincoln, two thick, large, oversized volumes published by Johns Hopkins in 2008, Michael Burlingame observes that Lincoln, quote, was a martyr to black civil rights as much as Martin Luther King and other figures of the 1950s and 1960s. In April 1865, I can assure you, the overwhelming majority of loyal citizens would have described their slain president as a martyr to Union. At the end of the war, with the Union salvaged and emancipation accomplished, most loyal citizens believed they had taken care of everything. There was no groundswell of support for doing more, for maintaining a massive military presence in the former Confederacy to guarantee equal social and political rights for freed people. Parenthetically, I'm going to say there never was an occupation at all of the former Confederacy. That's something that the Lost Cause writers latched onto and loved to throw at people. Oh, the boot heel of the Yankee occupiers were down here. They tormented us for 12 years after the war. The occupation was awful, even worse than the war. That's a long entrenched notion of Reconstruction. It just happens not to be true. There was no way the United States was going to put in place a real occupation of the former Confederate States. Three factors would have prevented it in any case and did prevent it. There is a long-standing tradition in the United States that loathes large, peacetime, standing armies. And that's what it would take to do this. There was also an unwillingness to pay the cost of a true occupation, but more than either of those, there was a widespread indifference to the plight of freed people in the former Confederacy. The kind of concern about the freed people that would have said, yes, it's going to cost a fortune to keep an army in the field, but we're going to do that because our work is only partially finished at the end of this war. Understanding the degree to which loyal citizens considered union the primary focus of the war renders the story of Reconstruction intelligible. There's no lost moment of possible racial accommodation at the end of the Civil War. The 14th and 15th Amendments grew out of intransigence among former Confederates whose actions in the summer of 1865 and later, with a big assist from our boy, Andrew Johnson, second worst president in American history, without question, ahead of only James Buchanan, who's in the triple sub-basement all by himself, then Johnson, then you can argue about who's the next one, but don't argue about those two, please. They are all alone in splendid isolation. The 14th and 15th Amendments grew out of this intransigence among former Confederates that began in the immediate aftermath of the war. In the summer of 1865, it deeply offended people in the loyal states who wanted to honor the sacrifice of more than 360,000 United States soldiers who had died from their perspective in a war to to restore the Union. The rebels were acting as if they hadn't lost the war. And Andrew Johnson was letting them do it. And it was that kind of behavior that pushed the loyal citizenry to go farther than they ever would have gone before. To put this another way, for most of the loyal citizenry, emancipation marked the end of a story, featuring issues relating to slavery as a corrosive dimension of political life, not the beginning of a story that would move on to achieve full racial equality in the United States. For them, the real beginning was for a newly restored nation, an emerging economic colossus, liberated from the sectionalism that had long threatened the work of the founders. As a profession, we normally scorn Whiggish interpretations or teleological trappings. We also deplore navel-gazing frameworks that fail to place American history within a more spacious world context. I find it fascinating that much of this recent literature can lead to a sense that emancipation was an inevitable outcome, rooted in the conflict's earliest episodes, a long-deferred step toward fulfilling the promise of the nation's foundational documents. It's a striking example, to repeat myself, of the Appomattox Syndrome, of beginning analysis with knowledge of the United States victory and emancipation, and working backward to chart the road toward those inevitable achievements. In fact, the Confederacy could have won independence, or the war could have ended with the United States victory and slavery still intact. The latter scenario, indeed, nearly played out in the spring and early summer of 1862. Only the serendipity of an artillery round that disabled one Confederate general, Joseph Eggleston Johnston, and elevated another, Robert E. Lee, to command of the major rebel army defending Richmond, only that in June and July of 1862 averted a collapse of the Confederate state. The Confederate state was on the ropes in the spring of 1862. Unmitigated disaster in the Western theater. New Orleans gone, Nashville gone, Memphis gone, 100,000 United States soldiers in northern Mississippi at Corinth. And here the largest army of the Republic is 5 miles from Richmond. 5 miles. With a general in charge who loved to retreat, Joseph Eggleston Johnston, who the first thought every morning was, God, it's a great day to retreat. Which way can I go? The wounding of Joseph Johnston changed the entire equation. R.E. Lee steps to the fore, and things all of a sudden get far more complicated for the United States. Had Richmond fallen in June? I hate counterfactuals, but I'm going to just embrace this one. Richmond would have fallen in June or July 1862. George B. McClellan, little Jorge, could do one thing. He could lay siege to a place because it didn't involve movement. And he had an opponent who would have embraced that. Let's don't do anything today, okay? That's good for the besieger. Richmond would have fallen. The Confederacy could not have emerged from the loss of their capital in combination with the loss of everything that had happened to them out west. And emancipation was not on the table in a significant fashion in early July 1862. Why did it get on the table? It's the 7 Days battles. It's Lee's victory. It was after that Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act. Right after that, Lincoln told his cabinet that he was going to issue a proclamation of emancipation. These things are tied together. It's not coincidence. The war could have ended that way. As late as the incomprehensibly awful summer of 1864, when civilian morale in the United States reached absolute nadir. As late as that, virtually no one in the United States would have said victory was inevitable. Lincoln predicted failure for the Republicans in his famous blind memorandum of August 23rd, and emancipation certainly would have come as a great surprise to Democrats who imagined that they could glimpse victory in the upcoming elections, and more tellingly, to more than 3 million black people who remained enslaved in the Confederacy, even at the end of the war. Even at the end of the war, only 1 in 7 enslaved people had been freed. That's in May of 1865. As for the war's most important outcome, survival of the nation dwarfed all others. Emancipation loomed largest for approximately 15% of the American population. It's an incredible milestone for the enslaved population, whose emergence from what Frederick Douglass called the hell-black system of human bondage marked one of the great moments in United States history. But emancipation was an internal phenomenon that had almost no effect on the actions or standing of the United States on the world stage. For Europeans and for others around the globe, the war's greatest legacy was a reunited nation that by 1900 boasted the world's largest economy, was joining the ranks of major imperial powers, and throughout the 20th century would wield unmatched economic, military, and diplomatic power. A Confederate victory in the Civil War would have changed the contours of the 20th century in ways we can't put our finger on, but in ways that surely would have been striking. That's the longest part of this talk. Now comes the short part. We're approaching the end, believe me. The second thing I want to take up is whether the war ended at Appomattox. And here is where I think anachronism gallops into the picture. Present concerns can lead to an ahistorical expansion of Civil War chronology. I think in part because recent conflicts have lacked clearly delineated beginnings and endings, there's a tendency to ascribe similar characteristics to the Civil War. Within this chronological reframing, the war did not begin at Fort Sumter or end at Appomattox and Durham Station, but rather extended through Reconstruction or through the Jim Crow era or down to the present. The war that never ended model that can allow investigation of the war without ever really coming to terms with the war itself. On April 10, 1865, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles mused about news of U.S. Grant's, quote, capture of Lee and his army, which had happened the previous day. The tidings were spread over the country during the night, noted Welles, and the nation seems delirious with joy. This surrender of the great rebel captain in the most formidable and reliable army of the secessionists virtually terminate the rebellion. Welles predicted there would be some continued, quote, marauding and robbing and murder, but no great battle, no conflict of armies after the news of yesterday reaches the different sections. One day later, George Templeton Strong, the Observer New Yorker, whose diary ranks among the best of all 19th century American accounts, suggested in clipped sentences that the demise of Lee's army carried decisive weight. People hold the war virtually ended. It looks so. Lee is out of the game. I wonder if Ernest Hemingway read Strong as a young man. It seems that he might have. Acerbic Richmond editor Edward A. Pollard, whose massive Southern history of the war chronicled the stormy life of the Confederacy as it unfolded, echoed Welles and Strong. In the final volume of Southern History, completed in 1865, Pollard remarked, quote, the surrender of General Lee drew after it important and rapid consequences and in effect terminated the war. All these three witnesses anticipated how most Americans would understand the end of the Civil War, but an increasing number of scholars have questioned whether Lee's surrender should be reckoned the decisive indicator of Confederate national failure and the effective end of the war. The onset of the sesquicentennial of Reconstruction has inspired a good deal of attention to what historians have labeled the long Civil War. And in our world, we know there are long everythings. There's the long this, the long 19th century, the long, and some are really long. But this is the long Civil War. This builds on a phenomenon that has been present for a number of years and seeks to emphasize post-war violence in the former Confederacy and the conflict's other enduring consequences. For far too long, argue those who embrace the analytical lens of a long Civil War, a disproportionate number of authors and readers have burrowed ever more deeply into the period, that tiny little slice of time between Fort Sumter and Appomattox. A longer perspective works against a focus on Appomattox, of course, which stood alongside Gettysburg as one of the two events that received the most attention during the just finished sesquicentennial. Too much attention to Appomattox, in this view, creates a misleading impression that U.S. Grant and R.E. Lee fashioned an agreement that ended fighting and opened the way for reunion and reconciliation. I wish I had time here to debunk the idea of easy reconciliation, but I don't. So don't worry about that. I'm not going to be talking about that. No serious person can dispute the necessity of placing the Civil War within a spacious 19th century landscape. More specifically, any attempt to grasp the centrality of the war to the larger story of American history must take into account long-term racial, constitutional, social, and commemorative effects. We're in Charlottesville, we're dealing with commemorative aftershocks 150 years later. With Lee's statue. Lee's statue is just one of them. They're all over town, in case people hadn't noticed. It's possible to give a lost cause tour of Charlottesville, which I do. There's an equestrian statue. There's another one. There's a Confederate soldier in front of the courthouse. There's another one in the University Cemetery. There are tablets on front of the rotunda. It's all around us, not just in Lee Park. Many of the profound questions with which the Civil War generation grappled remain present in some form as we move through the second decade of the 21st century. Continuing debates about state versus central authority, the difficulty of ordering a biracial, now multiracial society in a fair manner, the challenges of a military occupation, the friction between military and political imperatives in war, and wrangling about messy aftermaths of armed confrontations all bring Civil War examples to mind. But constructions of a long Civil War should not obscure the fact that the conflict, which placed more than 3 million men under arms and killed perhaps a quarter of them, did end in 1865. Clear indications of this fact include the surrender of all Confederate military forces in April and May 1865, dismantling of the Confederate state, restoration of the Union, destruction of slavery, and the rapid demobilization of 1 million citizen soldiers of the United States. These are huge outcomes that underscore the unequivocal termination of a war that had the verdict of the battlefield been otherwise, would have established a powerful republic devoted to the perpetuation of slavery. The stakes were really high in the long term here, really high. The political and social conflict that followed Appomattox should not be considered an extension of the war by other means. Post-war violence, however grotesque at times, did not approach in scale or fury the seismic military carnage of the war years, the bloodiest incidents during Reconstruction, among them the New Orleans and Memphis riots of 1866 and the Colfax massacre of 1873, scarcely would have risen to the level of a minor skirmish during the actual war. Moreover, former Confederates perpetrating much of the post-war violence had vastly scaled back their goals from establishing a pro-slavery nation-state to regaining local political power and maintaining white supremacy. Ex-Confederates mounted a determined effort to salvage what they could from their shattering defeat. Most almost certainly would have preferred to reinstitute slavery, but they settled for a watered-down version of what the Confederacy had provided, namely a social structure within which white people exerted economic, legal, and social control over millions of black people. The Jim Crow South, a reality by the late 19th century, lasted for many decades and should be considered the most obvious expression of the Confederate generation's response to defeat and emancipation. To describe post-war events as a violent continuation of the military action of 1861 to 1865, however, robs the most all-encompassing war in American history of much of its singularity and meaning. Too great an emphasis on the long Civil War, in fact, can reduce the war itself to just one episode or event among many, and strip Appomattox of any claim to signaling the conclusion of a nightmarish conflict. U.S. Grant, it's worth mentioning, immediately accepted the surpassing importance of what transpired on April 9th, 1865. In his memoirs, he averred that Lee's surrender essentially closed the rebellion. "I determined to return to Washington at once," he explained, "with a view to putting a stop to the purchase of supplies and what I now deemed other useless outlay of money. For the General-in-Chief, managing the transition to peace had already begun." I'll close by saying that the need to find a usable and affirming past always has been present and always will be. Similarly, historians' experiences and current motivations almost certainly will continue to affect much scholarship, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with either one of those things, so long as we also keep in mind their potential to obstruct rather than to enhance an effort to recover to the degree possible with our imperfect sources what actually happened and why events played out as they did in an upheaval as complex and important as the American Civil War. Thank you. Paul just nodded at me, and I saw his lips move, and it said, questions. So if there are any. And there's one from Professor Giuseppe Kett.
Comparing the Confederacy with Germany in World War II, Hitler was always firing generals for defeatism. It didn't matter so much if they lost the battle, just their attitude. And that seems to have set in pretty early, possibly as early as 1942. If you look at the Confederacy, and I think this would support the argument you're making about inevitability, if you look at military commanders in the Confederacy, when were they saying this war is lost?
When we're military, Joe's setup comment is that Hitler started firing generals fairly early in the European War. When did Confederate generals decide the war was hopeless, when the war was over? It depends on when you read their stuff. If you read them during the war, it happens much, much later. If you read them retrospectively, they'll say, oh, I knew at the time of Gettysburg, or I knew at this time, or I knew in 1861. Lee claimed after the war that he'd recommended to Jefferson Davis in 1861 that he should free all the slaves in the Confederacy, that would help the Confederate cause. Well, that has a nice ring to it, but there's nothing in Lee's hand anywhere near 1861 that suggests that he actually did that. So I don't think most of them, I mean, we wish they would have known. The usual turning point, the great turning point, the point at which everyone knew what was happening, and they just got out their calendars and circled April 9th, 1865, wrote Appomattox above it, and started crossing days off until they got there. It was Gettysburg. Oh, Gettysburg, 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 the great turning point. Gettysburg. No, it's not that way at all. There's no great turning point. If you read the evidence forward, you just get such a dramatically different understanding of what's going on. And one thing that jumps out in the starkest clarity is that the most fraught moment of the war for the United States came in July and August 1864. A point at which much of the scholarship says, well, everybody knew the war was already over by then. The Confederates are just sort of running on fumes because they don't know what else to do. That's just not true. It just isn't true. It was much, much later than we think. I think most of them, after Lincoln was reelected, knew that that's a really bad piece of news for Confederates. But until just before then, it was a much more problematical issue. Yes, Professor Holt.
Comment. I think you let Oakes' terrible book off too easy.
I have a reputation for being mean to people, Mike. I was trying to be nice.
That the Civil War made no difference. There was going to be emancipation anyway.
Right.
But you divide your talk into, you said, two parts. One is the story of emancipation, the other is the long war. But in fact, aren't they connected by the fact that since the 1950s, race relations has been propelled to the front as by far the most important, if not the only question that matters in America?
Yes, your comment is, or your question is, the two parts of my talk actually related? And the answer is yes, they are related. But they're also different questions to a degree. I think what is really related here is acknowledgement that union was the overriding goal for the white loyal, and I always say white loyal citizenry, not the North, because the United States isn't the North during the Civil War. It's the North plus 4 slaveholding states that stayed loyal, plus a big chunk of Virginia that decided it would it became in effect a 5th border state. Was originally going to be called Kanawha, as many of you know, but then decided on the much more colorful and imaginative West Virginia. For most of those people, the very large majority of them, it's a war for union. If you understand that, Reconstruction makes more sense. We often read arguments about how they just didn't stick to it long enough, the North, in Reconstruction. They just didn't follow through. They didn't think there was anything to follow through on. Union, check. Emancipation, check. That means union won't be threatened in the future. That's our list. Our list doesn't have 3 things on it if we're white people in most of the North. It has 2 things on it. Restore the nation, get rid of the issue that might undo the nation going forward. True equality for millions of freed people is not on that list. No matter how we squint or turn the pages of evidence we're reading, it just isn't there. They just don't care, most white Americans. It's only the behavior of former Confederates that pushes the white North as far as it went, in my view. That's the only reason. I mean, Reconstruction's sort of a miracle. We get the 14th and 15th Amendments out of a society that by our standards is profoundly prejudiced. Profoundly. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Vermont, I didn't say Maine, Alan, or Iowa, or Tennessee, or South Carolina. By our standards, mid-19th century, white people in America were profoundly prejudiced. The 14th and 15th Amendments are because of the post-war behavior of former Confederates.
Yes. Gary, in your opinion, what do you think is the best popular representation of the Civil War or some aspect of the Civil War?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think there are a lot of good, but I think that I'm just going to take care of a colleague here. I'm going to say that Liz Barron's book, titled Disunion, ! is a wonderful book on the coming of the war. Liz is all over union, just the way I am. And so, I mean, her book gives a very good sense of how the word union is the most potentially volatile word in the political vocabulary of mid-19th century Americans. There's just no question about it. And we, as a society now, have absolutely no sense of what it meant then. I mean, it's literally gone. That meaning of the word union.
Gary, I love Liz's book, and I make all of my students in post-World War II history read it. And it's a very popular book. But by popular, I mean films or general readership, articles. Let me rephrase that. Film. What do you think is the best representation?
Oh, what do I think is the best Civil War film? Glory. I think Glory's the best Civil War film. I don't even think it's even close. It has a lot of little things wrong with it. Gets a lot of little things wrong. It gets the big things right. So I would say Glory. And it was a revelation to me. Because I didn't think, well, I'm not even going to tell you about that. I think Glory is the best. I think that Daniel Day-Lewis's performance in Lincoln is transcendent. I don't know how any other actor would ever play Lincoln. I think the movie has a lot of problems, but I think Daniel Day-Lewis in it is wonderful. I love a little movie called Pharaoh's Army, which Steve Cushman and I learned about from one of our students in a colloquium we taught a few years ago in American Studies. I'd never even heard of it. One of our students was in it. He said, "What do you think about Pharaoh's Army?" I said, "I don't think anything about it. I've never heard of it." And he brought me he brought a videotape and watched it. It's a marvelous little movie with Chris Cooper, and it's a great little movie. A little slice of the Civil War. Most of them are awful, but a few of them are good, and those would be 2 of the ones I like. Yes?
Gary, I think we all have a deep sense of enormous commitment to either slavery or anti-slavery, but as you point out, we don't understand union. So can you say a bit more about the deep motivation, what really generated the level of violence and the duration of it around the concept of union? Can you say just a little bit more? Because you say that is it.
Yes, that's it.
What is it?
What it is to them is the legacy of the founding generation that was paid for by the blood of the revolutionary generation and then maintained by the sacrifice of that generation going forward that created the Constitution and passed that along. And what it gave them, they are unabashed exceptionalists. That's the E word in our world. We don't like the word exceptionalist. They are unabashed exceptionalists. They look around. the Atlantic world, which is the world that matters to them, and they say small d democracy is nowhere else. This is the only place. Universal white male suffrage, basically in the United States. By our standards, it's a limited suffrage. By mid-19th century standards, it's a breathtakingly broad suffrage. They paid attention to Europe. They knew what had happened in the late 1840s in Europe, and they thought Europe was going the wrong way, and they believed that only in the United States do you have a voice in your own government, and only in the United States do you have the ability, not the guarantee, but the potential to rise economically. You're not doomed to be what your father was. And if you allow these slaveholders to break the nation apart just because they didn't like who was elected, no one said Lincoln cheated, nobody said the election was stolen. If you let them do it just because they don't like who won the election, then you're proving to the oligarchs and aristocrats of Europe that people are not capable of self-government. They cannot survive even a presidential election. And if it breaks up once, why won't the Midwest go next time? When they don't agree with what New England wants to do, and pretty soon you do not have a nation anymore.
I understand that, but you also said, if I heard you correctly, that the Union was reasoning exactly along the same lines. They wanted to save the heritage of the founding fathers their own way, so they wanted to break the Union for the same reason.
The Confederates, of course, Olivier, that's why we love history. Because it's complicated. Everybody wants to be right with the founders. Of course they do. The Confederates said, hey, who's out of step with the founders? They're slaveholders. So are we. The Constitution protects slavery. So do we. Who are the ones who are betraying the founders? It's the Yankees who are doing that. Of course they were right with the founders. They put George Washington on their Great Seal. Everybody wants to be right with Jorge. And it doesn't matter which side of the Potomac you're on. Yes, they all claimed it. They had a different vision of union. What they are doing, in one sense, although they don't deploy the language because union is applied to the other side, they're essentially reconstituting the union that they think is the real union in this new republic. That's what they're doing. So you're absolutely right, yes. And the what? Well, the West, yes, that's the new wave in the literature now. That's coming. And so I'm going to get to upset a lot of people by what I say here. The West is out there. The West is not at the center of the American Civil War. Well, lots of people are kind of saying that it is now. I mean, extension of slavery into the West is really important, but yes.
So either people know now or they're going to know, if they're paying attention, the time at which the Lee and Jackson statues were put up was
right.
Not necessarily about the Confederacy, but about that particular time, right?
Right.
I'm trying to think of now, if we look 20 years, 40 years, 60 years ahead, we may very well have a country which actually doesn't see slavery as the moral blot that it does now, or may see people of color or different color, different religions actually in a way that we would want to be seen today. And I'm wondering, what is the message that we want to give today with either those statues there or with our other sort of statuary and the way we memorialize to generations that are yet to come about who we are today?
No, well, I mean, that's an issue. That's an issue. I just did a program with Coy Barefoot about that, and have talked a lot with colleagues about it. There are very different views of that. I'll give you my view. I'm not going to speak for anybody else. My view is, don't take down statues. I think you need to leave the memorial landscape in place. I think it's important to have those statues because they force us to deal with what was going on in 1921 and 1924. They force us to deal with that part of Charlottesville's and Virginia's and the South's and the nation's history. I think they should be used. I give lost cause tours of Charlottesville where I use all of these statues as teaching tools, and I talk about how they don't all mean the same thing. The one put up in 1893 in the University Cemetery, I see as really a Confederate statue. The Lee Monument, which went up so much later, I see as a Jim Crow statue. I mean, I think there are different purposes for these statues. I think they need to be interpreted differently, but I'm very wary of starting down the road of pulling down parts of a memorial landscape. I'm absolutely in favor of adding things to memorial landscape. One thing that Liz and I are trying to do with the new Now Center is get all the names of the African-American men from this area who ended up in USCT units, United States Colored Troops units, and find out if there were any white students from UVA who ended up in the United States Army, and I promise you there had to be, get all those names together and put those up somewhere here so that that will be, okay, so there are the 500 UVA graduates who died in the Confederate Army on the rotunda, and here are the names of the ones who fought for the United States from this area. I wouldn't take the ones off the rotunda, but I would add something else. And there are very good arguments not to do that. People of very good intent, I think, can disagree about this, disagree about the best way to handle it. I'm just wary of sanitizing memorial landscapes. Yes, Tico.
Does union help us explain why the war was so violent?
Well, I think union, well, in this sense, I think it does. The hardest thing for me to explain to students is why someone from Vermont would put on a uniform, pick up a musket, and risk his life to make South Carolina come back into the Union. Why didn't they just say, finally, South Carolina's gone? I've been waiting for this for a long time, and now they're gone. Break out the port. How do you explain that? And I think that the only thing that really explains that, I don't mean every soldier in a blue uniform was just on fire for Union and chanted Union before they went to sleep at night, but I think it's the one thing that explains why you had the response that you had in 1861. The absolute majority of all soldiers who fought in the Civil War were true volunteers, true volunteers. Both sides resorted to the draft, but a majority of soldiers on both sides were true volunteers. And I think the only thing that explains how the war could last as long as it did is that there were enough people who were simply not willing to give up what they saw as an effort to protect the legacy of the founding generation, that they carried the war farther than it would have if there hadn't been an animating principle like that at work. That's what I really think, Tico. And it almost wasn't enough, but in the end it was. It's very hard to get people to understand. You mean they died for that? I mean, there's no threat that rebel armies are going to march into Vermont. There's just no threat. They're not going to come to your county. They're not going to end up in Iowa. They're not going to go to Chicago. So absent that, how do you get people to hang in with a conflict like this? Yes, Eric. And anybody who wants to escape should feel free to escape right now. But now, Eric. Well, people were walking past you and I thought I should, yes. Yes, there is. Yeah, absolutely. Eric asked if there's a religious dimension to this, and of course there's a religious dimension to it on both sides. It doesn't mean it's not always, they're not always yoked, the kind of secular union and the more religious union, but they often are. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think what made it sacred in a way that it's hard for us to recapture, I don't even pretend that I can really understand it, is there's this sense they're not that far from the revolution. And they're certainly not that far from the Constitution. And a significant number of them had known people who literally tied them to the revolution. And I think that if you go to the end of Lincoln's first inaugural address, where he used language, he got help from William Henry Seward here, but it's the very last part, the very lyrical part of the first inaugural address that talks about what links them to every heart and hearthstone, to the revolutionary generation and the dead. I mean, it's just this powerful evocation of what enabled us to get here and what is threatened by what these states are doing. I think it's hard for us to, I don't even pretend to really understand it, but I know that it's at work. It's at work. There's nothing comparable in my life. I don't have anything that affects me that way, but it's there. And I know it's there because it shows up in so many ways, in so many places. One of the best people, I mean, Whitman goes on and on and on about union. Steve Cushman put me on to this when I did the Union War. Whitman wouldn't have been in the Union War if Steve hadn't put me on to it, but he also has a beautiful, beautiful explanation of why it is that you cannot let union go, because you're going to lose so much more than just what's happening here. There really is a transatlantic dimension to this for them. They pay much better attention to Europe than Americans now do. I mean, they actually knew what happened in Europe in the 1840s. Yes?
Hi, I'm a first year, and I'm in Professor Duke's class, Writing and Writable Wrongs. My group, we're analyzing the Robert E. Lee statue. Professor Duke's already asked your opinion of like taking down statues, but I was curious, what is your opinion of the Confederate flag in its current context?
Oh, I
in
look
the
at
United
the
States?
Confederate flag very differently than I do at the memorial landscape. I think the Confederate flag should not fly over any kind of public anything at any level of government, local, state, national. It's still jarring to me when I get off a plane in Memphis and drive somewhere into Mississippi to see the St. Andrew's Cross battle flag as part of the state flag of Mississippi. I see the flag differently. And I think if you want to put it in your front yard, the First Amendment covers you there. But any kind of display on a public building of any kind, I think it should not happen. Absolutely shouldn't. Yes. And Paul, you tell me when this needs to stop. You are the closer.
Oh, good. So I want to offer just a simple what made unions so compelling from someone who works on George Washington in that time of the era. And I would summarize it as greatness. For them, the union was the key to greatness. And you can start defining greatness however you want. But without union, we weren't great. We were just another tiny little insignificant place.
Yes, or just a bunch of states that happen to be hanging out together for a while. Washington is also, we've also lost a sense of Washington. I mean, Washington is so important to both sides in one sense because he's the absolute ideal of the citizen soldier. The citizen soldier, and in a very small way, every other citizen soldier is like Washington, he has his uniform on, he's successful, he takes his uniform off and goes home. He really is Cincinnatus to them, and they talk about that. And then he has power again and gives it up again. I mean, he is the model, and they're sort of doing what Washington did in their own little way, but it's an army of people who embrace this notion of a citizen soldier, something else we don't have a sense of anymore. When they had the grand review of the United States armies in Washington, D.C. on May 23rd and 24th, 1865, the comments from the newspapers, the newspaper coverage, has that theme throughout. These are, what's the most remarkable thing about what we're watching today? The most remarkable thing is these are not going to be soldiers in a little while. They're going to be back home as citizens. And they came forward in the crisis, and they did what they needed to do for the Union, and now they're going to go home. And 80% of them were home by November of 1865, and all but 11,000 of them were home after a year. Of the million, there were 1 million men in the United States Army in May of 1865. Thank you very much.